So this lesson 1.1b is going to delve a little further into writing notation, how to do it correctly, and what they actually are. In the lesson 1.1 overview, we talked about notation when we were writing domain and range. But I want to talk a little bit further about the three types and how you use them and which one we're actually going to be using. Our first type of notation is called inequality notation, and it uses our inequality symbols. So we're using less than or greater than, less than or equal to, greater than or equal to. We know from way back that when you don't have the line underneath, your graph contains an open circle. When you do have the line underneath the equal to part, your graph contains a closed circle. This comes in really handy when we are trying to write notation for different graphs. You can see this red one here has two open circles, which means that I'm going to be using my inequality symbols with the open circles. I'm going to start with my leftmost number, which is -1. Then I'm going to use my inequality less than, x, goes in the middle, and then less than my topmost value, which is 2. What I'm essentially saying here is that x is between -1 and +2. And I'm using my less than, not less than or equal to, because I have two open circles. If I look at this blue one here, I'm going to work backwards this time. My topmost value is at -2. Now that's an open circle and the graph doesn't exist, so I'm going to use my less than without the equal to. But what is my bottommost value? This arrow tells me that this goes on forever and ever and ever and ever to negative infinity. So anytime you have an arrow, it means that your graph is going on to either positive or negative infinity. It's a little unnecessary to write that. So this would be perfectly acceptable if I just wrote x is less than -2. In fact, I would prefer that, okay? So when we're doing inequality notation, if there's an arrow on the end, you don't really have to write that side because it's assumed to be infinity. That's inequality notation with your inequality signs. The second type of notation is called interval notation and uses parentheses and brackets. But it works just like the inequalities. So a parenthesis would be an open circle, a bracket would be a closed circle. And then you write it very similarly to inequality notation. Start with your bottom value, go to your top value, and then enclose it. I'm going to use parentheses, again, because I have open circles and it doesn't exist at those points. Looking at my blue one here, I know that my top value is -2, and I'm going to use a parenthesis because I have an open circle. My bottom value I talked about is negative infinity because the arrow says that it goes on forever. Anytime we're talking about infinity, positive or negative, you're going to use a parenthesis, not a bracket. Your graph cannot exist at the point of infinity or negative infinity, okay? Even though Buzz Lightyear tells us to go to infinity and beyond, he's mathematically incorrect. You cannot ever get to infinity, let alone go beyond it. Every time you go as far as you think you can always go a little bit farther. If you're graphing numbers, go to -1 million. Well, what about -1 million 1? You can keep going and never reach that number of infinity. So we always use a parenthesis or a less than sign for that. The third notation that we talk about is called set notation, and it's very, very similar to inequality notation, but it uses some brackets. So I am going to use my bracket, and I'm going to say x such that, and then I'm just going to write my inequality notation. So x such that x is between -1 and 2. And then I am, of course, going to remember to close my bracket, because that's very important. Looking at this next one, I'm going to say x such that, with my bracket, x is less than -2. So you can see the inequality part of this is exactly the same as the inequality part before. We're just adding some brackets and things to it. Now, what if we have a graph in two variables? We actually split it apart into the horizontal variable, which is domain, and the vertical variable, which is range. Domain is going to look at the wideness of the graph. What's the leftmost point? What's the rightmost point? Range is going to go bottom to top. So if I look at this, my bottommost, I shouldn't say that, leftmost point is at this -1 here. So -1 is going to be my leftmost point. And I am actually going to use not a parenthesis, a bracket, because the point exists. If it helps, make yourself a little chart. Less than, greater than means we have an open circle, means we use parentheses. Less than equal to, greater than equal to means it's a closed circle, and we're using brackets. Okay? So for interval notation, I'm going to use a bracket on this one. I'm also going to go far right. This graph goes all the way to +2, and I'm going to use a bracket for that as well because the graph exists there. If I wanted to write inequality notation, I could do it the same way. -1 is less than or equal to x is less than or equal to +2. So same numbers, you're just writing them a little different, whether using brackets or inequality, or even a little bit of both with set notation. To say that x such that x is between -1 and 2. So our domain can be expressed in a couple of different ways. We mostly like to use interval notation. That's what you'll be seeing mostly in class. However, it's good to know the other two and have seen them before. You may or may not see them when you get to take the ACT. Now let's talk about the range. So range is bottom to top. The bottommost point on this graph is right here at 0. So my range is going to be 0. And I'm going to use a bracket for that as well because the graph does exist. If it didn't, you'd have an open hole at 0 here. Now, how far up does the graph go? It goes all the way up to 4, where the graph exists as well, so I'm going to use another bracket. Make sure you understand when to use parentheses and brackets. That's really important. Now, if you're writing an inequality, again, you can use the same things, but you're going to use a less than or equal to. And this time I'm talking about y, not x, because I'm talking about range. And remember, range is vertical, which is y. If you forget, you can see that right on your axes. So you know, horizontal is x, vertical is y. And then last but not least, let's do set notation. So I'm going to start with my bracket, y such that y is greater than or equal to 0 and less than or equal to 4. And there we go. Okay, those are your different notations. Again, we are probably going to be using interval the most in class, so really make sure you understand the difference between parentheses and brackets. Maybe include this little chart somewhere in your notes so that you have it. And then it's really good, again, to see set notation as well as inequality notation. But in class, we're really going to focus on interval notation. As always, I hope this helps. If you have any questions, let me know.